Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the iology Hub. The iology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The iology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the iologyhub.com. Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. It's great to be back. I hope you've been enjoying listening to my colleague Ian's podcasts. So I'm stepping in at the moment to cover off some sustainability standards, which I'm really excited about producing and getting out there in September. So we're going to be having a sustainability series on all the various ESG disclosure reporting that seems to be taking off in a big way. So we've got that to look forward to in September. But for now, I wanted to highlight something that does come up quite often as a query with the team at Carbonology. So for those of you that don't know, I'm the CEO at Blackmores and also at Carbonology. So both companies specialise in standards, but Carbonology specialises in the carbon standards and in particular verification of greenhouse gas emissions. And a question that comes up quite a lot is, what is the difference between the GHG Protocol versus ISO 14064 Part 1? So I thought I'd record an episode just to highlight some of the similarities and also the differences. And actually, in summary, there's a lot more similarities. They're very, very similar, in fact, than there are in terms of the differences. So at the end of this episode, you'll have a broad understanding of the differences and the similarities between both standards. So greenhouse gas emissions accounting has become increasingly popular for organisations, and also not just popular as a trend, but also it's becoming more and more of a mandatory requirement. So it's actually something that is now actually included as part of organisations, particularly large companies, part of their financial reporting on an annual basis, which is why I'm going to be talking more about that in September as we go through the GHG emissions reporting disclosure requirements. So the whole point of the greenhouse gas accounting is to help to manage an organisation's environmental impact and to contribute to climate change mitigation efforts. So the two prominent frameworks that we're going to be talking about is the ISO 14064 Part 1 2018, which is the international standard for greenhouse gas emissions reporting, and also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard. So while both aim to standardise greenhouse gas accounting, which is fantastic and is very much needed, not just in previous years, but even more so now and in the future, they both possess distinct characteristics. So this episode is going to help us to explore the key similarities and the differences between both frameworks and helping you to provide a comprehensive understanding both for people that are just interested in this area but also practitioners as well. So as we know, climate change concerns having specific methodologies in place to help to quantify and to report on an organisation's greenhouse gas emissions. And standardised frameworks help to provide a transparent and reliable approach for organisations to measure their impact and to contribute to environmental sustainability goals. So rather than just making it up as they're going along, both of these frameworks provide that robustness in terms of a specification on how greenhouse gas emissions can be reported on. So in terms of the similarities, let's start there because there are fundamentally more similarities than there are differences. Both of these standards share a fundamental foundation in greenhouse gas accounting principles. And in terms of some of those key areas of alignment that are pretty much identical, is the greenhouse gas scope definition. So that's the first thing I'd like to pick up on. Both frameworks categorise emissions into the three scopes, which I'm sure for those of you that are practising in sustainability at the moment, we've got Scope 1, which is the direct emissions from owned or controlled sources that you'll be familiar with. Scope 2, the indirect emissions from purchased electricity, heat or steam. And then finally, Scope 3, which is probably the most challenging area for practitioners. That's the other indirect emissions throughout an organisation's value chain. And that's quite often where it's a bit of a grey area because sometimes it can be quite challenging getting data from third parties. Other times it can be confusing in terms of double counting for data within the value chain as well. But in general, the greenhouse gas emissions covered in both the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard do conform with the ISO 14064-1 if significant Scope 3 GHG emissions and GHG removals are both considered. I mentioned earlier about the principles. So in terms of quantification principles, both of these standards emphasise the importance of accuracy. And that goes without saying. We can't have organisations making up the numbers. The accuracy, completeness, consistency and transparency is absolutely of paramount importance with GHG accountancy reporting. And also it focuses on the relevance of these principles when quantifying emissions. So it's great to see both standards are on the same page when it comes to the scope definitions and quantification principles. Another area where they're aligned is the GHG reporting boundaries. So both require crystal clear definition of the organisational boundaries for which emissions are quantified. When it comes to the GHG inventory, both frameworks guide the development of a GHG inventory, which is fantastic news for organisations that are new to creating a GHG inventory. So this is ultimately a comprehensive record of all organisational emissions. So there's some of the similarities, and they're actually core for both standards. Let's look at the differences then. So in terms of the differences, despite having that shared foundation, there are a few key differences between the two frameworks. I'd say 14064-1 is a more procedural framework. That's in terms of commentary for the research that I've done. It's identifying it as more of a procedural framework, which basically means it helps to outline the steps for quantifying, reporting and verifying greenhouse gas emissions. The GHG Protocol, on the other hand, offers detailed guidance on calculating emissions for various activities and sectors, which is a good thing, but it does lack formal verification requirements. And that's one of the reasons that carbonologists specialise in verification against ISO 14064-1 through ISO 14064 Part 3, which are the specific verification requirements that go into even more detail on the due diligence and governance that should be in place for verifying greenhouse gas emission statements. In terms of the level of detail, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides a more comprehensive and detailed approach, including calculation methods, guidance on emission factors, and best practices. So that's a big plus for the GHG Protocol. ISO 14064 offers a less prescriptive approach, which helps to allow organisations to choose their own calculation methodologies based on their specific needs. So I can see this being both a positive and a negative. I think for those organisations that are looking more guidance around the calculations, then GHG Protocol is great. But if it's an organisation that would like that flexibility to potentially go above and beyond it, or you could argue not as thorough, then that's where the other standard comes in. In terms of avoided GHG emissions, the concept of avoided GHG emissions isn't addressed in 14064-1. However, the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard does address the quantification of avoided emissions, which are required to be reported separately. As I mentioned earlier on verification by a third party is optional under the GHG Protocol, but mandatory for organisations seeking public disclosure or certification under ISO 14064-1. So verification enhances the credibility and reliability of reported emissions data. So what this basically means is that voluntary and mandatory schemes, such as, for example, CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, which I'll touch on in a later episode, other requirements such as EcoVadis, they're voluntary schemes where you can get a much higher rating on their schemes if your greenhouse gas emissions are independently verified. So research shows that ultimately 14064 is a better framework if you're looking at going down the verification route, again based on research that's been undertaken. In terms of value chain emissions, so while both frameworks acknowledge Scope 3 emissions, the GHG Protocol offers a dedicated standard, which is the Corporate Value Chain, Scope 3 standard, which helps to provide specific guidance on quantifying these emissions. Now, there are several other standards out there in the ISO world, which also touch on Scope 3, but this one is specifically the Corporate Value Chain through the GHG Protocol, which again, that's another positive there. Are you new to ISO standards and want to know what it's all about? Or maybe your company has multiple ISO standards, but there's a lack of engagement and compliance. Whether it's quality, sustainability, or risk standards, the iology Hub is your one-stop shop for all your online learning resources associated with raising your company's standards. From as little as £99 a month, you can have unlimited access to hundreds of online training courses and achieve certification for completion of courses along the way, which will take you from learner to practitioner to leader in no time. So what courses are in the Hub? Well, there are courses on everything a head of quality, sustainability, information security and health and safety would need to manage compliance and raise standards. With over 100 courses available to you, here are examples of just a few. ISO 9001 Internal Auditor, how to transition to the new ISO 27001 standard, the role of ESG in quality management, and how to integrate management systems. But it's not just courses in the iology Hub. You can access templates, downloads, and action checklists to take your business to the next level. So why not try the iology Hub today? Just click on the link at www.iologyhub.com and you'll get access to all our resources within minutes. If you're interested in embedding best practice across your organisation or would like to develop an awareness and training programme for employees, we offer a free learning and development session to tailor a bespoke training programme based on your organisation's needs. So we'd love for you to join as an iology Hub member. Just head over to iologyhub.com to get access to your unlimited training and compliance resources. And finally, when it comes to addressing greenhouse gas emissions and removals, 14064 clearly addresses greenhouse gas emissions and removals for each category and removals, which therefore constitutes an inherent part of the GHG quantification. The guidance in the GHG protocol isn't as clear on this in this particular area, but it does allow for the reporting of removals separately from greenhouse gas emissions. So I apologise for some of our ISO show listeners that are only interested in the mainstream standards like 9,000, 14,000, etc. This is obviously quite a technical area, but it's something that's coming up quite a lot when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reporting. And I think, rightly so. I think that when it comes to the accuracy and complete transparency of the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, no stone should be left unturned. So I think it's important to look at the differences between these two standards, because I think what you'll probably find, in terms of coming to your own conclusions, is that there are pros and cons of both. Okay, but both of them are providing extremely high standards when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reporting. One thing I'd like to touch on is reporting on indirect emissions, because this is an area that we find most organisations are struggling with. Generally speaking, scopes 1 and 2 is pretty straightforward for an organisation, but in some cases scope 3 can be like opening a can of worms. So I just wanted to touch on where these two standards are similar and different when it comes to scope 3 reporting. And the reason that I'm focusing on this is that there is often quite a lot of confusion based on a lack of clarity and understanding of how granular the data actually needs to be, combined with the challenges of extracting data from third parties, which I mentioned earlier on. So let's look at the standards then in relation to reporting on indirect emissions. So ISO 14064-1 is very clear regarding which Scope 3 emissions are to be included, whereas the GHG Protocol Standard may be viewed as more open to interpretation. And again, that could be a positive or a negative for your organisation. So ISO 14064 includes direct GHG emissions and removals, indirect GHG emissions from purchased energy, transportation, products used by the organisation, and also associated with products from the organisation, and finally indirect emissions from other sources, which again, that could be open to interpretation. And Category 4 also references emissions from the use of services by an organisation. So in contrast, GHG protocol standards require the inclusion of Scope 2, indirect emissions from purchased energy, and the inclusion of other indirect GHG emissions under Scope 3 is optional. So I'll just repeat that. The inclusion of other indirect GHG emissions under Scope 3 is optional. So the GHG Protocol Standard is referred to in various GHG reporting and disclosure initiatives whose requirements for reporting of Scope 3 emissions may vary. So again, it will be your decision as to how flexible you want to be in terms of the reporting. But the key thing here is to be transparent about it. If you're going to exclude something, be very clear. If you're going to explain your methodology for inclusion and exclusion, just be crystal clear. So, in terms of ISO 14064, This has been created and approved by representatives from 61 nations to determine a specification for Scope 3 emissions reporting. So you could say that this standard has a higher level of input from various industries across all continents across the globe, basically. So I think what I've done is hopefully highlighted for you the similarities and differences so that you can make your own mind. But ultimately, as I said, both of them are fantastic frameworks. So when you're choosing a framework, if you're not quite sure which way to go between 14064 and the GHG Protocol, here are a couple of considerations for you. First thing I would recommend is establish whether there is a need for verification for your organisation. Now, this is going to depend on the size of your organisation in terms of whether it's a mandatory requirement or whether you would like to voluntarily seek verification. And I have done a couple of episodes on the value of verification before. But basically, if public disclosure or independent verification is desired, ISO 14064 might be the better choice due to its verification component. And the governance for this is provided in ISO 14064 Part 3, 2019, if you'd like to find out more information about that, which is ultimately the specification with guidance for the verification and validation of GHG statements. So if you're going for verification, 14064 is, in my opinion, and I'm slightly biased because obviously I have got an ISO standards background. I've worked with over 20 different ISO standards and I can see the benefit of the additional part when it comes to verification. I think the other consideration when choosing which framework you're going to use is the level of detail required. If a detailed approach with extensive calculation guidance is preferred, then the GHG protocol might be more suitable for you. I think with the best will in the world, obviously we're talking about all of these different requirements, you need to have the resources available in order to be able to fulfill this obligation. So I would evaluate the current resources that you've got available, both internally and then who you might want to source externally. And I guess at this point I should probably mention that Carbonology can assist with the verification. And also in terms of the carbon calculations and reporting. However, we can't do both for the same company because there's a conflict of interest there. In terms of disclosure reporting requirements, what I'd recommend here is to check which sustainability disclosures your organisation needs to comply with, because this will determine whether you need verification as an optional requirement or mandatory. So they're just a few of the key considerations that I would recommend when you're looking at making a decision on this. Now, obviously I'm talking as though you have to choose one or the other, and actually you don't. Because of the complementary nature of these standards, which I've just been hopefully explaining about clearly, while distinct, the two frameworks can be used together effectively. So organisations can utilise the GHG Protocol's detailed guidance to develop a GHG inventory and then follow ISO 14064 processes for verification and reporting. So why not cherry pick the best out of them to complement your business? So basically, in conclusion, both standards play a crucial role in promoting standardisation and also having a reliable GHG accounting practice in place for your organisation to follow. And hopefully this podcast has helped you to understand the similarities and the differences between these frameworks, and hopefully that knowledge will help you to be empowered to take responsibility within your organisation to select the most appropriate approach for your organisation to help you to measure and report on your environmental impact and also obviously verification where needed. So I'd like to highlight that integrating the strengths of both of these frameworks can actually lead to a robust and transparent GHG accounting system for you and ultimately statements on an annual basis, which will hopefully ultimately help to contribute to a more sustainable future. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. Again, apologies if it did get a bit technical in parts, but when we're looking at the similarities and differences of two really important standards that are out there right now, I think it's been essential that I've brought to you that level of detail. If you've been driving along listening to this podcast, don't worry, the notes are all in the ISO show notes there, so you can access that with the link to whichever media player you're listening to. And I'd also like to remind you that if you've got any questions at all about greenhouse gas emissions reporting, or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or ISO 14064, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us over at Carbonology. And again, our contact details will be available in the link. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the sustainability series on ESG reporting coming up in September.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.